Hello, and welcome to the Video Essay Podcast, a show featuring conversations with leading practitioners of videographic criticism. I'm your host, Will DeGravio, and a few days ago on Twitter, I teased a very special surprise, an announcement about the future of the podcast that I would be sharing on this episode. And the surprise comes in the form of another person. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Will.
So the surprise news is that Emily Coe is now joining the Video Essay Podcast as an associate producer. And Emily has already been helping me out behind the scenes in so many ways, including chiefly getting me really excited and re-energized about the podcast for this coming year. But welcome, Emily. It's so great to have you here and to be working with you.
Thank you, Will. Yeah, I'm so excited to be part of this. It's crazy going from a listener to seeing all the amazing work that you do. So thank you.
No, thank you, really. I'm the one who's indebted to you. So for everyone listening in, Emily and I met, I guess it would be close to 3 months ago now, which is pretty crazy. In early December 2021 at UMass Amherst, which I don't know if I talked about this event on the podcast itself, but I wrote about it in the newsletter. I was invited to UMass Amherst to give a keynote address, which I still can't really believe I did. Something
so awesome. Yeah.
Like something I didn't feel qualified to do, but like luckily Emily was there and gave an amazing presentation and screened her video essay on Citizen Kane. It's Transcending Bazan's Dichotomy. I think I also shared it in the newsletter and stuff. It's amazing, and you should go check it out and check out all of Emily's work. But yeah, like I think I was waiting, like preparing my notes or whatever, and like we started talking, and you were like, "I love the podcast." And I was like, "Oh my god, like really?" Like it's so weird because I feel like for so much of this, the podcast has been like in the pandemic, so I don't really get to like run into people and who like know it. So it was like a very cool experience. And then we started talking, and talking with Daniel Pope and Barbara Zecchi, who are both faculty at UMass and who I've worked with before and who are both fantastic. They're like, oh, yeah, Emily's the star of the UMass Film Studies department.
Oh my gosh.
So we started talking and then we watched your video essay. I was like, oh my God. And then you expressed interest in like helping me out. And I was like, yes, please. So, yeah, I mean, did I miss anything? And please tell the listeners like who you are and how you got interested in video essays.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I was so excited to meet you because I had been listening to the Video Essay Podcast regularly and actually learning a lot from it. And so I was like, yes, I need to tell him how excited I am about this podcast. So, but yeah, so I'm Emily, and I'm currently a senior at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm in the Film Studies program, and I am interested in videographic criticism because I think video essays have made me think about films in a different way or have awakened me to things that I hadn't noticed before. So I'm really looking into exploring the unique capabilities of the form, like what can we discover by writing with a moving image. So yeah, that's what brought me here.
Heck yeah, and everyone should really go watch Emily's video on Bazan and Citizen Kane, because there's a moment in that video where you attempt to kind of recreate certain elements of the film, which for me was like an incredibly innovative approach and something that I've seen others sometimes attempt to do, but it's like really hard to do. Can you talk about that moment and describe it better than I am now?
Yeah, no. Yes. So it's a split screen. So I'm using the images from the film to create a different type of sequence. So it's the same sequence, but in the actual film, it's just one long take, like a deep focus long take, or at least an illusion of it. But then I use images from the film on the other side of the split screen to kind of imagine what it would have been like if it used analytical editing. So there's a lot more intercutting, there's a lot more close-ups, so it was difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the kind of thing that I would be curious to talk to someone who was not familiar with like an editing software and videographic criticism about that, because one of the things that's so interesting about this kind of work is that in watching your video, it's so clean and makes complete sense that it kind of masks the labor behind it, and like the work and the tact and the knowledge of the object, that it's like hard to fully appreciate it. So I feel like sitting in the audience, like knowing like the technical side and the audio visual criticism side, was like, whoa, like this rocks. And so,
Thanks.
you're still wrapping up your studies at UMass. So I will save the dreaded question of like, what are you doing after? Like, but everyone should just know that Emily is now a part of the podcast. I'm sure you'll be hearing from people who listen, and we'll figure out a way to, we're slowly figuring out how Emily's going to become more integrated into the podcast, but her voice is definitely something you'll be hearing at the beginning of each of these episodes. She was present when we recorded the current episode today, which features a conversation with Jordan Schonig, who's a lecturer at SUNY Binghamton. And Emily has been like kind of listening to drafts of the podcast, helping me through, like looking over questions. And I think we're really at the early stages of what I think is going to be a really awesome partnership and collaboration, and thinking about like where we can take the podcast going forward. And I'm excited to hopefully perhaps work through some of that, like on air with you. And as I've said before, like the listeners are always giving me feedback and ideas, and like that's where the best stuff comes from. So I hope, please use this as an opportunity, if you're a listener, if you've had ideas and things like that, to share it with me and Emily. And so I'm feeling really excited, because this summer will be 3 years of the Video Essay podcast, which is pretty crazy. So, and I'm sure down the line, maybe Emily will interview her own guests or co-interview folks with me, and we're really just figuring this out. But right now, Emily, it's just so great. It's just so great to have you here.
Yay. No, thank you. I'm so excited to see this podcast evolve, and also our roles evolve too.
Absolutely. And I will say it's really like, I feel like, one of the, like for me, I started this podcast as, basically right after I left Middlebury as an undergrad, which wasn't that long ago, like it's 3 years ago. Feels like yesterday to me, but I'm sure it will always feel that way. And so I think having the perspective of like, and someone who's gone through videographic criticism, like as an undergraduate, and like continues to maintain this interest in it, like I just feel like a kinship with you in that way. So I feel like the partnership here, like that's what's so important. And that's like kind of the vibe of the Video Essay podcast, I guess, is to just like really it's a way to like keep learning. And I feel like the podcast for me was my way to like
Absolutely.
Keep doing that as I was like fighting back tears leaving Middlebury, and so I think, that spirit, I'm super excited to like be working with you in that regard, and to like, kind of bring that back into the fold here. So, but let's now transition to teasing the interview, because if you're saying no, we don't want Emily to go, not yet. This is just only the beginning. So, and obviously I'll link to like Emily's Vimeo page and whatnot, like on the website. And Emily will definitely have to get, I'm just thinking out loud now, we'll have like a little bio for you and updating the website and things like that. So definitely some things that need to be done, but this is the first step, and it's very exciting. So, like I said, this episode features a really great conversation, and I'll be curious to know what you thought of it, Emily, with Jordan Schonig, who, like I said, is a lecturer at SUNY Binghamton, and also hosts, has made a number of academic audiovisual essays. But one of the reasons that I was particularly excited to talk to Jordan was he also runs a YouTube channel, Film and Media Studies, with Jordan Schonig. And so he's this really interesting figure, because he kind of is bringing, he kind of weaves together the popular and the academic in his work, and is kind of involved in bringing kind of academic arguments, breaking them down, making them more accessible, and making them free and easy to find for really anyone who is interested. So if you want to learn more about tracking shots or cross-cutting or Laura Mulvey or Andre Bazin, maybe you watch Emily's video and you're like, I need more Bazin in my life, and then you can go to Jordan's videos and see that. So he's a really interesting person. And it was really great to talk to him, kind of how he thinks about, one of the things we talked about was that he's very early in his career in academia. And I think at one point in the interview, he says, I'm at the beginning of my career, but maybe I'm also at the end. Like, it's hard to find full-time tenured work. And so really interesting to hear his perspective there, and also to hear his thoughts on how he thinks about YouTube. Because so often when we talk about YouTube, we talk about people who are, who live on YouTube full-time, or for the most part full-time in their work. And Jordan really has one foot in each camp and is really thinking about the pros and cons, the benefits of each, the benefits and disadvantages of each. And so I just found it to be a really invigorating discussion. Emily, I'd be curious to know, what'd you think as the fly on the wall?
No, yeah, I was lucky enough to observe the magic that happened during this conversation. And there was this one moment, and I called it the eureka moment, when Will and I were kind of debriefing afterwards. And when Jordan describes how videographic criticism can be a form of cinephilia, and he kind of gives a definition of what a video essay does and can do. And so I thought that was awesome.
Yeah, let's actually play that moment right now as a little teaser for folks listening in. Here it is.
And I think what you can do with videographic criticism, that you can take the marginal and blow it up, or you can slow it down. You can get people to fixate on things that are ephemeral and fleeting. That itself is like a visual instantiation of a mode of spectatorship that some, like Chris, will call cinephilia. And so it made perfect sense, I think, for me to create videographic supplements for each of these chapters that are somewhat about cinephilic modes of seeing. Most of the things in my book are about tiny little fragments of movement. And I'm like, this thing is interesting. Do you think it's interesting? I want to show you why I think it's interesting. You can read my chapter about it, but better yet, let me show it to you. And, do you see what I see, right? And so that do you see what I see, I think, is at the basis of this phenomenon that Chris is interested in, historicizing and theorizing and investigating as this aspect of film theory that has this beautiful through line.
So there it is. I agreed with you totally, Emily. I remember looking on the Zoom call. So basically, I just invited Emily to join this conversation just to kind of give her a sense of how the sausage gets made, so to speak, and just to kind of, and also if she's like, dude, you keep asking these questions in a really weird way, you got to change that. So I was kind of curious to see what would happen. And I saw you, Emily, kind of make a excited note, or you kind of grinned or smiled during this. And I also noted this quote too, as just being a really great example for me of why I personally am so passionate about this form. The idea that, in this quote, he's talking about the Lumiere films, and just the idea that through this form, we can see the earliest, some of the most well-known images in moving image history, that we can see and experience them in a new way still. It is it makes me, I might have even said in the conversation, it makes me emotional, thinking about that. It's such a beautiful thought. And in thinking about your video essay on Citizen Kane, I remember I started making videographic criticism the same semester that I actually watched Citizen Kane for the first time. And I remember feeling so excited about it, but then going to the library and seeing rows of shelves of books just on Kane, right? And countless book chapters. And you think to yourself I want to try and play around and do something a little bit original, a little bit unique, as much as, one can, and balancing the life of being an undergraduate and still learning these things. And to then have that outlet of videographic criticism to try and express something in a new way was so important to me. And I don't know, I think that's why this quote kind of resonated with me.
Yeah, I think video essays, you can reimagine an experience of a film. And that's what's so special about it. And I think that's what I loved about Jordan's video essay, The Wind in the Trees video essay. There's that one part where he replays that clip from Brave, and he slows it down and plays it again, and you really get to focus on the hair. And if I had watched that film without seeing that video essay, I don't think I would have noticed the hair really. But yeah, that's what's so special about it.
Absolutely. And I think exactly, sometimes for me, that I love the phrase you just said. I think it was reimagining the experience or feeling of watching a film. And I think for me, what's so exciting is sometimes those moments sneak up on you. Like, when I can remember the first time I saw the shower scene in Psycho, and there are video essays that recreate that feeling. But then sometimes you'll watch a video essay on a film that you don't think about that often, or that doesn't hold a particularly special place in your heart. And then someone reimagines and recreates it, and you go, oh my God, like I did have this feeling, and now I'm feeling all these other things. And so it's really quite exciting. And the conversation with Jordan, I think, really, and just watching his work in general, really left me feeling like just inspired, and also trying to think about different ways that I can engage with the material that I'm watching. Like, even outside of videographic criticism, like, I just want to be a more informed viewer and think about how animation works. Like, on that level, that's what I love so much about the video, apart from the poetic approach he teaches, but just the things he breaks down and the things he breaks down and explains. I didn't even really know that before. And so, like, just learning is really special. So on that note, let us now transition to the conversation with Jordan. But first, very important first, I want to remind everyone here to please consider supporting the show on Patreon, patreon.com/thevideoessay. I'm hopefully going to be starting blogging there a lot more going into the new year. I haven't been super great about it, and I apologize about that. But one of my ongoing blog series there for patrons only is I'm going through all of Kogonada's videographic criticism. And kind of writing short capsule reviews one by one. Emily knows this because we talked about it. I saw After Yang a couple weeks ago, which was phenomenal. And so hopefully at some point I'll have a review published. The idea was to kind of have After Yang be the last thing that I watched, but then I saw an invitation to a press screening here in New York, and I was like, okay, well, I have to go. So that's kind of something to look through on the Patreon page. And maybe that'll be something that me and Emily talk about, and we kind of reimagine and things like that. So, but I also think of the Patreon page as kind of just helping sustain this show and On Your Screen and the other things that we do. Please also subscribe to Notes on Videographic Criticism, our newsletter, which you can find at thevideoessay.substack.com. Follow us on Twitter at The Video Essay. We're also on Facebook. And please also subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts and leave a 5-star review. And if you want to write a little blurb review, that can be good too. I don't really know what the point of those are. Like, I'm not exactly trying to compete with the rewatchables here. I don't know. Maybe that's one of, Emily, maybe that's one of your goals.
It actually is.
It is? Okay, good. I love that. We need that competitive edge. But if anything, it'll make us feel good. Maybe you can be like, Emily rocked, like, so glad she's here. Like, finally we can stop listening to that one dude go on and on. So please consider doing that. And so without further ado, here is our conversation with Jordan. And so we'll begin where we begin with everyone, and that is, could you tell us what your origin story is? When were you first introduced to video essays, and when did you get the bug, as we call it?
Yeah. So I have a hard time remembering exactly what video essays I was watching when I first got into them, but I know there's probably a small family of makers that I was watching very early on. And that included people like Kevin B. Lee, people like Tony Zhou, Every Frame of Painting, and Taylor Ramos, I think. Katie Grant, who back then I knew as Catherine Grant, who was who I was introduced to through Film Studies for Free when I first got into graduate school. And then I started to find her videographic work. And I think Christian Keithley was one of the first video criticism makers that I got interested in. And it's hard for me to pinpoint a year But recently, a friend of mine told me an anecdote about how she and I met, and I had forgotten that we had met at a conference in 2013. And she said, what I remember about you and about meeting you was that we were both interested in video essays. And that completely slipped my mind. I wouldn't have been able to pinpoint that year, but I can confidently say I was interested in video essays as early as 2013.
So that's pretty early. And you attended graduate school at the University of Chicago. So is that correct? And so were you at that point engaging with videographic work? Like at what point did you begin to sit down and begin making things yourself? Like did you first have kind of a more academic interest in it?
Sure. Yeah. No, I got my PhD from University of Chicago, but I started my PhD at the University of Pittsburgh from 2011 to 2013. So some folks that I know through video essays also went to school there in Pittsburgh. I want to say that I first started watching scholarly video essays. Like I think Catherine Grant and Christian Keithley were probably the first couple people I was getting into. And then I was introduced to the world of say, Vimeo and YouTube a little bit after that. And I think at first I was probably thinking, oh, this YouTube stuff this is not what I do. And then I realized, oh, wait a minute, I actually really like just what you can find on YouTube, and it's kind of blown up in the last decade. But for a while, I'd never made a video essay. I just kind of thought it was cool, and I thought, one day I'll sit down and I'll either use Windows Movie Maker, or maybe I'll fork over the cache and get a more proper video editing suite, and I'll play around. And that, at a certain point, I think before 2017, where I went to the Videographic criticism camp, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I can't remember when this happened, but I had this thing that I wanted to make. And I think maybe I was watching supercuts or people who were doing kind of compilation videos. And I had this compilation that I wanted to make for whatever reason. I don't know, but I just wanted to make it. So do you know the movie Brief Encounter? Right. So do you know the scene in Brief Encounter where the protagonist is about to throw herself in front of the train, and she stops right before she does, and there's this like holding shot of her face with the light from the train flickering on her as the camera at a canted angle slowly rights itself as she kind of regains composure. So, I mean, I love that film, Brief Encounter, and I love this moment. It's like hard not to be wowed by a moment like this. But then I got fixated on other scenes from movies that were this, right? So there's a moment in Deep Blue Sea by, I think that's Terrence Davies, in which is basically an homage to this. And then I was thinking about other moments. I think there's a moment in, I can't remember what, but it's one of those melodramas of the unknown woman, as Cavell calls them, with a similar thing. And so I wanted to find as many movies as I can in which someone stood in front of a train with the light flickering on their face, because I just found this to be a compelling image, and I thought it would look cool to kind of create something where you juxtapose them. Like I had this inclination for a supercut, but I could only think of like 5 or 6 examples. And I think I had like Windows Movie Maker, and I like found these clips on YouTube, and I like put it together in this very amateurish, shoddy thing. But like, in a sense, it was my first like dive into it, because I had an itch that I needed to scratch, and I wanted to like make something, and I could barely figure out how to use the software, but I found it interesting and fun. And then I didn't make anything else. This was like a 3-minute thing. I didn't tell anyone about it. It was just like a thing that I made. And it was really with 2017 scholarship in Sight and Sound at Middlebury, where I had the experience of, okay, I saw the call for applications. I was interested in this thing. It was at the tail end of graduate school, really. I was just about to defend my dissertation. This seemed like kind of an interesting thing to do. And frankly, it was one of the best, if not the best thing that I did in graduate school, just in terms of camaraderie, in terms of excitement, of like the really good vibes that can happen in academic spaces where people are mutually encouraging. The mentorship that I got from everyone involved who was running the program, I loved everything about it. And I like to say I made my first proper video essay through that experience.
I definitely want to follow up on Video Camp in a second. But my first question is, does that original supercut exist somewhere online, or do you have it somewhere? Or because I would love to watch it.
So it does exist on my YouTube channel. It is actually the first video chronologically on my YouTube channel. And you can tell it dates about 4 years ago, but I had made it probably 6 or 7 years ago. I just knew I would like lose it. And so I just archived it on the channel because it's a good place to keep stuff. And yeah, no, it's shoddy. Like the aspect ratios are off. I didn't even know how to resize images. So like there's one of the clips is from like from a Chaplin film, and it's like small. I really didn't know what I was doing, but you can tell like I wanted to make something and I made it, and it exists. I showed it to Katie Grant. I don't know how I mustered the courage to show her something, but Katie Grant is so, as you know, she's so encouraging and generous, and kind of is someone, as an academic, who makes you feel as if you can kind of bare your soul and feel comfortable doing it. And so I said, Katie, do you think this is interesting at all? And she was like, oh, this is interesting. I was like, oh, great. So it does exist.
And also a great person to show it to, who obviously has engaged with Brief Encounter videographically.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, Katie, right. in a fantastic work. And, it's funny you mentioned that, because for me, I'm excited to go watch the supercut after our interview's over, and I'll link to it on our website, or if you can find it on Jordan's YouTube page. But sometimes those videos, even if they're the Chaplin image is not sized properly or things like that, it kind of bears like the traces of like the videographic impulse, like this desire to create, to make, to engage with it. And like you can really feel that on those videos it's like, here is someone who just has this idea and they just want to get it out into the world, and the polish is not what's important. And to me, having not seen the video, but heard people describe videos and go through a similar experience that you did, like that, those to me are my favorite kinds of videos.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, right? Like the ones that are at the very early stages, like what compels you to make something when you really don't know the tools that you're using, right? And I think for so much of us who do this, right, you learn to do something through the act of wanting to make something, right? It's hard to imagine learning the ways in which the editing suite works if you've never done editing before, abstractly, before you want to make something, right? At least the video camp ethos is kind of like you learn the tools through the desire to make something.
One of my ideas that I would love to do someday, and if anyone's listening and really loves this, feel free to steal it, is to like do like a video essay film festival, but it's only like people's first video essays or something. Or you could do like a pairing of their first and their most recent or something like that, and to just kind of see everyone's kind of origin stories play out, I think would be really special. But let us get to Video Camp, because I'm particularly excited to talk to you about this for a couple of reasons. One, and we just established this before we started recording, I was at the Video Camp that you were at. I've written about the significance of covering that as an intern at the local Middlebury town newspaper. And I mean, if I don't do that, I'm not here talking to you and doing all of these things. But what was significant about that year is it was only graduate students who could apply to Video Camp in 2017, I believe, or was primarily a graduate student year. And I think you might be the first. I apologize if I'm wrong, but we've had alums of Video Camp on before, but I think you're the first of that year specifically. So I've a couple different ways to approach this, but my first is how do you remember feeling at the time about incorporating videographic criticism into your dedicating your time to as a graduate student, because so much has been written about, is videographic criticism accepted? Is it not? It seems to be growing more, like that was 5 years ago. But even just as recently as last year, Kevin Ferguson and Drew Morton had an article essentially guiding people through getting this work accepted when they're up for tenure or applying to jobs and things like that. So do you remember feeling any of that skepticism? Was that something that you talked about with your fellow video campers? Like, could you just take us in, I guess, the general mood and vibe of people there and what was going through your head at the time?
Yeah, I feel like that was very much a topic of discussion in Video Camp 2017, right? We would often discuss the status of this approach to scholarship as a question of legitimacy in the academy. But already by that time, a big step had been taken toward legitimacy because of In Transition. Right? Just the fact that there was this journal called In Transition, and it was associated with probably the biggest and most important major journal in film studies. That was huge. I think back then it was Cinema Journal. And the fact that you had this kind of body of video essay creation and pedagogy associated with people like Jason Mattel and Christian Keithley. The fact that you already had that means that like you had made a lot of steps toward that. At the same time, I was not thinking I would incorporate any videographic work into my, say, PhD. Like, I was happy enough, like, doing this thing. I mean, I would have been happy enough, like, doing this thing for 2 weeks, hanging out with these people, learning from them, like, absorbing myself in the practice of videographic criticism, and then not having anything added to my CV at the end of this. I was very much happy with that. I also knew that there was something, like, I thought, oh, it could be cool to try to make something and maybe see if I can get it in transition, right? Which is what I did. So that was a nice kind of, slice of legitimate academic recognition for the stuff that I did there. But I don't think most people were planning on the possibility of making videographic criticism part of their dissertation. But I do remember maybe one or two people in particular who did do it, and who kind of got the idea for it through video camp. And I know one person was successful. Her dissertation was not completely videographic, but I believe that she successfully incorporated videographic works into her dissertation, and they were recognized as real parts of her scholarship. So I don't know what the precedent was for that, but it very much existed. The ideas were being tossed around at this space in 2017, and they were put into practice quickly after.
Do you remember what you worked with at the video camp? Like, what were your source materials?
Yeah, so how I remember video camp going down, and you probably know this well, and probably better than I do, is I remember the first thing that Jason and Chris asked us to do was pick a film that we would be working with these videographic exercises. So you had to commit to one film, and I committed to the movie Gravity, which I think, when you're in these academic spaces, at least for me, I'm always like, ooh, bad choice. You always like, you choose something, you're like, ooh, this is not what I want to do to represent myself. But, I was writing a dissertation about movement and, camera movement and kinetic stuff. And so I was thinking actively about that film Gravity. I wasn't thinking about extracting any interesting philosophical thoughts from its themes and narrative, but from its cinematography, I was genuinely interested in. And so we did a number of videographic exercises, and I had to use that film. A couple times I thought it worked well, and a couple times I was like, oh crap, this is hard. And I distinctly, so you remember the Pecha exercise, right? That was the first thing that we did. And I remember thinking, oh, this is a surprising obstacle that I have, which is that Gravity as a film is too pretty. And its prettiness was actually an obstacle in me asserting my own authorial autonomy. Like, the shots are too picturesque and pretty and polished. And so it just looks like a fan vid. And very quickly I was drawn to making something that seemed, aesthetically pleasing. But then I realized, oh, wait a minute, this is not videographic criticism. This is the opposite. This is a fan video, and I need to assert my own interest above the gorgeousness of this film, right? Because prettiness, I think, is especially kind of sneered at within academic spaces, right? You don't want it pretty, you want it to be interesting. And so that was just one thing that I hadn't thought about until I was like, oh, this is one of the surprising pitfalls of working with certain kinds of material.
That makes a lot of sense. And it is that thing you don't realize until you start doing it, I think. And I also think that, so I've done the exercises a few times with various things. And so when I was the TA, I made them along with the participants, and I chose the HBO miniseries John Adams because I was interested in it, not in any formal way, but just in how is this like a nationalist? Like, how does this represent history? Like, I was interested in purely like a kind of a more political way. So I was like, okay, how do I maybe this will be an interesting challenge to myself to take something that I'm not interested in aesthetically at all, and then have to reckon with it in those ways. So it almost seems like you had the inverse thing where you're dealing with this beautiful object and then trying to figure it out.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, I almost wanted to say, wait, don't confuse me for this. I'm only interested in this film in these two ways. I'm not interested in these other ways. But yeah, exactly.
I have also heard those who are, and by heard, I mean probably I'm remembering YouTube comments or something, but the accusation that it's almost easier to make a video essay when you're dealing with like pretty images or things like that, as in like it's easier to just kind of co-opt the beauty of the cinematography or something like that. And so, which I never bought to begin with, but I think you've just outlined a case for why that really doesn't make any sense. And if anything, it can be harder to not just like elevate, just to bask in the glory of the image, and instead to actually try and cut through that and say something about it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. But I mean, we'll talk about this later, but I almost think that comment already marks a division between the scholarly video essay and the YouTube video essay. And I think one of the reasons I was so anxious about the prettiness of the images of Gravity was because I had intuited a set of maybe values attached to the scholarly video essay, where a kind of slickness, a prettiness, a fan vid-esque quality is something that we're markedly not trying to do. Whereas I think on YouTube, fan vid and video essay kind of almost share a spectrum. And I think that so many videos are kind of showing off the beauty of particular shots and creating a kind of satisfaction, a rhythmic pleasure, and setting them to music with kind of snappy editing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I definitely want to follow up on that as well, because I think there's a lot to unpack there in your work specifically. But I want to just continue kind of in thinking about your career now. So I'm correct in saying that you're still like in the early part of your academic career. And so the bulk of the scholars who I've talked to on the show fall into the group who, for the most part, have gotten tenure through a kind of the way that happens, and then are at a point in their career where they can pursue videographic work very much. And so I'm wondering how you think about that, and feel free to share as much or as little as you like. And just how you balance that. And I know you just have a book out now, which is fantastic. And so you're doing a bunch of different things. And so, but I would just be curious to how you find that balance and just how you approach it. Because I imagine there might be folks listening who are in a similar situation. And for me, as someone who hopes to perhaps be in a PhD program sometime in the next year or two, I'm asking for myself as well.
No, it's a good question. And I mean, the idea that I'm in my early part of my career is kind of a not even an easy statement to make, because frankly, I'm both at the earlier part of my career and at the later part of my career, depending on how things go, right? So I'm in a very similar circumstance to a lot of peers, right? And so I'm not sure how long I'll stay in academia and do this kind of thing. I've been a kind of roving academic for a few years now. I don't really think too much about dividing my time between videographic work and other work. I mean, because frankly, for the last few years, I've spent so much of my time on teaching and I guess finishing the book that I'm not doing that much in terms of like the publishing element on either side, right? It's kind of been a while since I've done like a new videographic project outside of the work of teaching. I mean, we will talk about this in a little bit, but in 2017, when I was part of the videographic camp and I made a kind of a standalone video essay, that was like, a work that I made. I put a lot of time into it, and I published it, and I haven't done anything since in that capacity, right? If I've done videographic work, I've always related it to teaching at this point, right? Because the last few years, that's really what I've been focused on, as I've been working these, fairly heavy teaching load jobs. So yeah, I do think it would be a different position to be as like a tenured professor and to really get into the videographic work as part of one scholarly output, the way that someone like Jason Mattel is doing, right? Really pushing the boundaries, getting recognized for the work that he's doing, and really kind of creating ambitious projects within videographic work that are more or less groundbreaking because no one else has done them, right? And he's convincing these large institutional bodies of the legitimacy of what he's doing, right? So I don't think I would attempt to do what Jason has been able to do simply because of the position that I'm in. And in terms of jobs that seem to, or job ads, I mean, there's only been one job ad that I've seen that seemed to say, we're interested in videographic criticism. And frankly, that was at UMass Amherst. And that was the only time I've ever seen that, right? So that's indicative of something that might be changing, where the very idea of videographic work might not just be seen as this oh, this thing that you can do if you say can, incorporate production elements into your film studies class, but it might be something more grounded in what an institution is looking for. But I would still say that that's the very early stages, because I haven't seen any other institution make it explicit that they're looking for someone with that kind of practice and expertise.
In that, I think that's a perfect transition to be talking about your YouTube channel, because I think a lot of times when we talk about videographic criticism in like the broadest sense, and I think that your YouTube channel and what we're going to talk about falls in that umbrella somewhere. And obviously you have made video essays that clearly do, but I'm talking about the lecture type videos that we're going to talk about. And I think that sometimes when we talk about the video essay, we talk about the pedagogical benefit of it, that these videos that are made can be used to teach something. But it seems to me like when we talk about that, that's just like one spoke in the wheel for a lot of people. But for you, it seems like with these videos, that is the driving force, is that teaching element. So it makes sense that that's the context in which you create, as you just said. And first, I also just want to give a shout out to the title of your book, which is The Shape of Motion, Cinema and the Aesthetics of Movement is the new one, is your new book. Congratulations again. But so you have a YouTube channel called Film and Media Studies with Jordan Schonig. And I would just be curious before we get into like your process of the channel, like when did you create it and what was your motivation for doing so? And then we'll get into kind of the nitty gritty.
So the YouTube channel, like a lot of other YouTube channels, was my quarantine hobby of 2020. I can't remember exactly when I decided to start putting videos on the channel. I was consistent with videos that I was making for teaching. I was teaching a full year's worth of coursework at SUNY Binghamton, where I currently teach now, but I was teaching it online. I was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan with my partner and teaching remotely at this new school where I had never set foot. And I was making video lectures because the courses that I was teaching some of them were very lecture heavy. I was teaching a 100-person intro film class. I often teach that class when it's that big of a class and kind of a lecture style. There's discussion, but it's very lecture oriented. And so like a lot of folks, I started to make videos that were video versions of my lectures. There was a point at which I thought, this online teaching thing is hard, and everyone is suffering. I'm suffering. Other teachers are suffering. People around the world are suffering. Students don't really want to do this. And some students were great, and discussions I had were great. And I was so grateful for just being able to have a teaching gig. But at the same time, right, as everyone knows who's done online learning, you can't make up for a lot of things. And so part of my motivation was, a lot of my students aren't watching my videos. I might be more motivated to put effort into these videos if I were to share them with other people. And actually doing that, it really improved my happiness and level of sense of purpose, right? When I realized, oh, you know what? I don't have to just keep these things on my computer and only for my students, who are 15% of whom are here for pure interest, 85% of whom are here for a breadth requirement. And, I like teaching in its largest capacity. I want to share ideas with folks. I want to help them understand things that they're interested in, but have a hard time understanding. And I didn't see a reason why sharing these videos on YouTube was a problem. And my boss was okay with it, right? I thought there might be, oh, are you okay with these materials, which are technically part of this university, being shared online? And he said, oh, why not? I don't care. And so I just started to do it as a thing. And then it became a kind of therapeutic hobby that I enjoyed. And then, as YouTube popularity can mean a lot of things. My YouTube channel is not popular in the wide in the wide frame of YouTube, but it also has gained small amounts of traction. And I have gotten the feedback that suggests that students are learning from it. And I'm like, oh, that actually feels wonderful. A lot of people who do teaching, whether it's at the high school level or at the college level, they all admit that they love teaching when they get feedback that suggests that students are appreciative and they learn something and they see something in a new way. And those are the things that allow teachers to be exploited because they feel so good, right? That's the affective capital that we're working for. And I thought, the fact that I can share these things and get that feedback, it seemed like a no-brainer to me. The only thing that was holding me back was an anxiety about sharing things that were unpolished. for the longest time, as you can imagine, academia is such a polish, wait 2 months, polish again, wait 2 months, and then publish. That's a kind of practice, and you internalize it. And so you become so used to not sharing anything until it's been through, 3 rounds of peer review. So I had to get over a hump of anxiety about sharing things that were not polished. But once I did, I just was kind of like, you know what, this is fine. I also kind of thought no other academics would ever find my YouTube channel. I was somewhat hoping that, this is only for the masses, or this is only for random people on YouTube who are interested in film or something. Eventually, yes, peers of mine found the YouTube channel. I don't know how all of them feel about it, but you know what, once you get over the hump of being a little anxious about it, I think it's okay. So yeah, that was my main motivation for doing it.
It's a very inspiring thing to hear, and especially the circumstances in which you started creating. It's funny, for those who are listening, the topics range from what is cross-cutting to what is the Laura Mulvey's notion of the male gaze, or breaking down Bazan or what have you. And they're really, I relied heavily on these videos. I foolishly took AP calculus in high school, and would while I'm doing my homework, would try and remember what my teacher had said, but then would need help with it, and go and how do you do. I've forgotten all of it, so I can't even give you for instance of an example of a type of calculus video I would Google. But that to me is what it feels like for you, and I can't imagine that And I went through your videos and found comments, as you say, of students being this is so helpful, thank you. And so, what is the who do you see as the audience? And I mean that in a specific way. Do you have a sense of, are they high school students, undergraduate students? Are they adults who are just wanting to be self-taught? And then who do you imagine you're making your video for? Are they two different audiences, or is it the same audience, or multiple?
So a majority of the videos I have on the channel were actually videos I made for classes that I've taught. So they were used in the classroom in some capacity, many of which were made for that year in which I was teaching online. So I quite literally made a lot of them for undergraduate students who are taking either intro film or film theory, or say a gender and sexuality and cinema course, or a cinema in the digital age course, right? Each of those classes in a way have slightly different audiences, if you're talking about the importance of audience. So yes, I teach intro film very differently from how I teach film theory, because the audiences are incredibly different. And that's something I think about all the time as a teacher. Whereas, you're performing for this group, for this abstract mass of students, but it's amazing how diverse the preparation and interest is across even, say, a group of 20 who are all film majors. So I think about that constantly. But for the videos that I have made, say, on the channel that were not things that I made for class, I make them as if I am making them for undergraduate students. But I have had some people say email me. I've had one adult learner. I forget how I knew that this person was an adult learner, not enrolled in college, but just said, you know what, I just like learning about this stuff. And could you tell me what that clip of that movie is in your jump cut video? And I was like, yeah, sure. So I have seen stuff like that. My sense is that most people watching the videos are probably undergraduate students. Some high school, if they're getting, say, difficult theory in high school. My sense is I've learned recently that I think people learn Laura Mulvey in high school. I certainly, yeah. I'm almost fairly certain that it does happen. It didn't happen for me, but it seems to be people who are interested in understanding the material, probably that it was assigned in class setting, with a small fraction of people who seem to be interested in learning and are okay with this lecture format, which is, of course, not the dominant edutainment format of YouTube.
Well, I'd certainly love to go to I wish I went to the high school where they taught Laura Mulvey. That audience, makes a lot of sense. And I see you have over 4,000 subscribers, and I hope it continues to grow, because I also think, I feel like every couple months there will be a writer who, some type of a culture writer or a political writer who's dipped into culture, and they write a whole column or something, and their understanding of some theory is completely off or misrepresented. And maybe they studied that in undergrad, and then they need a refresher and things like that, in the 10 years that have passed and things like that. And I've certainly started watching your videos just to get a little refresher on some things where I'm I think I remember What Christian Keithley taught me about this in film theory, but I maybe need a quick reminder and to go to your video. And so I think even, it's fantastic because a lot of them are like 3 parts and can be so rich if you want, or if you just want some type of refresher or way to engage, like that exists there too, because it seems like your titling and your captions and things like that are all geared towards that. Like it all feels very accessible, which I imagine is by design, and that you can find precisely what you're looking for fairly easily.
I wanted to comment upon what you were saying earlier about what you were in high school in calculus searching for videos. There was a point at which I realized that I started to search YouTube when I was trying to quickly grasp a complex theoretical topic as a graduate student. Now, I didn't tell anyone I was doing this because it felt wrong. I'm a graduate student, I'm a PhD. I'm supposed to, at best, look for secondary sources, like scholarly secondary sources, if I want to quickly understand X topic that's difficult. At best, if I'm really a scholar, I should be going straight to the source. And then I said, well, if I am doing this, if I find it useful to say, look at a couple sources where people try to break down a complex topic in a video form, and I have been basically taught to avoid that, or to do it the quote unquote proper way, right? Then I need to stop thinking about this as this, say, low form of learning. It's just the form of learning that we can't escape, right? That is just part of how people learn information. Like someone was going to make a video channel with film theory videos. Like someone is going to do it, right? So it made sense, like, oh, why not do that? Because frankly, like I will go back to my videos to refresh myself on some of the topics where, when I'm teaching Jean-Louis Baudry's apparatus theory, and I didn't have it as good as I had it when I made those videos. Like I don't have it as good in my head right now as I did when I made those videos. Those videos help me, right? It instantiates a memory, right? And so much what we do as teachers is we're lecturing, and I generally don't lecture from a script. I lecture from the slides that I make with maybe little bits of notes. The videos are useful for me to kind of refresh myself on how I thought about something, how I summarized it, how I understood it, how I explained it.
Some of what you're saying reminds me of, I was listening to a lecture that Katie Grant again gave a couple months ago, and I apologize to Katie in advance because I'm not going to put this as well as she did, but she was essentially making the point that when she makes a video essay, even if it doesn't have the markers of traditional scholarship, very citation heavy or something like that, she is a scholar, right? She has engaged with bodies of work that she brings through the process of creation, right? And so I think that's why these videos, teaching aside, like they are byproducts of your scholarly endeavors, right? And so I think that's what's so interesting to me about them, because they're made for popular audience. They do things that maybe the scholarly video or scholarship in general wouldn't do, but are informed by your expertise as a scholar. And that feels like an obvious point, but I feel like it's not something that until I heard Katie put it that way, I was kind of like, yes, that is the justification for so much of this work in my mind.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, the lecture videos, I don't try to do anything that resembles my own argument, or for the most part, I'm not trying to instill my own argument. I'm not trying to, say, put forth an original claim. In fact, I'm actively trying to suppress that. I'm trying to put forth what I understand is either a more or less canonical or standard account within film studies. And of course, it's impossible to pinpoint what that would be. This is just a kind of attempt of what I'm trying to do, or to elucidate certain passages, right? To take a difficult passage and to model what it would look like to break it down and hopefully inspire immediately my students who are trying to do something similar in their own papers to do something with different passages, right? That's the kind of thing that I'm going for.
Right. No, that makes complete sense. And I want to let's just pivot to discussing a specific one of these videos, and I'm sure we'll touch on some similar things. So I just, there were several different examples, but I went with the one titled Lev Manovich's "What is Digital Cinema and Compositing?" Just because to just kind of direct you, the listener, just to one specific example, but there are dozens of videos that you could go look at. And I'm wondering if you could just and walk us through the process of creation, because your videos to me resemble have mix of like the desktop documentary type feel to them. You're on screen talking, which is something that we would certainly associate with the YouTube aesthetic when it comes to video essay creation. So how do all the different elements come together from start to finish? And you can use this video as an example or just talk generally if your process is pretty similar across the board.
Yeah, I mean, my process is pretty similar across the board when it comes to these videos with like a little image of myself in the corner, right? So this more or less is just taken from a convenient mode of recording over a PowerPoint, which is the first thing I stumbled upon, and I kind of stuck with it. In fact, I remember when I was initially making these videos, I had a choice to make. It's like, do I do a voiceover or do I record a little box of myself? And I asked my students, I said, I'm asking you to watch this video, and it was film theory. So film theory, the students were a little more compelled to watch the video because the reading is darn difficult. And so I said, what do you prefer, like voiceover me or little tiny me in the bottom right corner? And they're like, we like little tiny you in the bottom right corner. I said, you know what? You got it. So I can thank a student, my class it was actually Michigan State University is when I first started recording, because that was the tail end of 2019 when everyone started to go online at the end of the school year. And so basically I had these PowerPoints that I would lecture over, right? I would have, and of course, when I'm lecturing, I have moments where I stop and I ask questions, and I have slides that are more discussion oriented. And making the video lectures was basically a way of quickly modifying those PowerPoints in such a way where I either took out those, question and answer style, or I converted them into something that I wanted to demonstrate with my own words. Then I would make a video. Now, the video you're talking about, the one on Manovich, compositing, and what is digital cinema, is one of the many videos that I made initially and then went back to and then added footage to it to quote unquote enhance it. That's how I think about these in my mind, is like these are enhanced videos. I had time to say re-upload them. I put them into Adobe Premiere. I found clips to play over them to, basically provide as much visual examples that would be both compelling visually, but also, demonstrative of the things that I was talking about. And I do it rather quickly, mostly because of the demands of teaching and timelines, right? These are not the videos I spent the most time on, but I do use the time that I have to say re-upload them to enhance them a little bit. So yeah, they're originally PowerPoints, and then they have clips baked right in. And in some cases, when I am lecturing, I'm like, ooh, you know what? This was better in the video. When I had like immediately an example that I put in. And so sometimes when I'm like taking these materials and putting back into the classroom, I'm like, ooh, you know what? This is actually better in my video, but that's not what we're doing right now. And so I'll just have that in my head. You're like, oh, I can't summon images with my hands to you, right? If that elucidates anything about the process, I'm not sure if that gets at it.
No, it does. I think you being in the box is like very essential to me, because I think what I appreciate about the videos is even though I could imagine someone doing something similar where they are literally just repurposing the material that they've already used and not like anything to it, like just like having their piece of paper and like literally doing like a not dynamic at all PowerPoint and like with just a straight voiceover. And I think with you, especially the ones where this one is like the enhanced video with the new images, and we see your body and your enthusiasm comes through in your gestures. It has this like this freshness and this way of engaging that I think is really essential, and that I think also elevates the video beyond like an illustrated lecture. Like your performance is essentially what you're doing. And so I think that absolutely reveals a lot about your process. And one of the reasons I chose this video just to highlight was because, this concept is different than perhaps your analyses of like, an editing technique or the male gaze, which is kind of this phrase and idea that extends beyond academia and someone may have encountered. And so when you're thinking about an undergraduate audience, like how do you tackle a topic like digital cinema? Because, and maybe this is a dumb question and we can move on, but I'm just wondering that if your audience is made mostly of students, then they presumably engage with digital cinema like the most, and it was perhaps the first kind of cinema they were exposed to, or the cinema they engage with the most. And so how do you go about exploring the nuances of that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And, a lot of my teaching involves questions of the digital and film theory. So this particular video you're talking about happens to be for one of 2 units on, say, digital culture and digital ontology and film theory. But I also have a course called Cinema and the Digital Age, which basically takes those issues and explodes it into a 15-week course. So I suppose I do have an interest in this, and I do enjoy teaching it, right? Usually that digital course that never has a problem filling up. Students seem to be interested in this question. I recently polled my film theory students and I said, which aspect of film theory interests you the most? And the digital thing seemed to be the one that people were really into. And I think it's partly for the reason that you're saying, is this seems to be the dominant mode that people are interested in. At the same time, when you're so close to something, when it is like the water that you swim in, it's difficult to abstract it and to put it in front of you and to think about it theoretically, and also to think about it as historically contingent, right? And so, part of my strategies for teaching these questions of, say, how did cinema change within the lens of film theory when it moved into various aspects of digital technology, is to try to remind students that the various aspects of digital technology matter quite a bit, and the various discourses that people attach to digital technology matter quite a bit. Some theorists claim X about this, and some theorists claim Y about this, and I'm really interested in getting students to think about the logic behind those claims, because they'll say opposite things about the same exact aspect of the medium. Like, the interest is certainly there, right? I think students are often really interested in, say, computer-generated imagery. They're interested in thinking critically about computer animation, right? They grew up with Pixar. They're now growing up with Marvel. And if there's a way to think critically about these things that are so ubiquitous, I think they're often drawn to it, right? And at this stage, Lev Manovich wrote this essay and the corresponding book, a long time ago now. And the references in his writing to, say, quote unquote CD-ROMs now involves things that they've never heard of, or at least they're like, wait a minute, what is he describing here? And actually that it can be really useful, because it invites the notion that the digital is this thing that is already different from what it was, say, 15 years ago. And the various kinds of technology have already changed. So yeah, it's a topic I love to teach. The Manovich is something that I think is fairly accessible. His writing style and what is digital cinema is a really useful and accessible argument. And I also teach it in intro film. And also I pair that with the Wachowski's Speed Racer, which is a film that I adore. And I can't think of a film that better exemplifies the visual logic of compositing than a film like Speed Racer, which is all about showing you the seams between image layers in a way that, say, if you watch a David Fincher film, you can't see the seams at all.
I really appreciate what you're saying. I would love to see your syllabus for that course. And I wish we could talk about the video in more detail and just digital cinema in general, because it's definitely the area of interest I'm moving into. And I see a lot of overlap with the kinds of things we talk about on this show and things like that. So maybe we'll have a whole series on digital cinema for the podcast another time. But I want to move here to talking about your other work. And you have a number of really great videos, one of which we will take a deep dive into in a moment, on your Vimeo page. And you have videos on YouTube and videos on Vimeo. And there may be a couple overlaps, but I think for the most part they're pretty separate entities. Like your video on the long take that was published in Transition is the follow shot. I'm sorry. Yeah, the follow shot is your Vimeo page and on In Transition. Walk us through how you make that division, and how we talked about this at the beginning of our conversation, but how you work through that spectrum and decide.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So technically speaking, everything that I have is on YouTube, but some of them are more pronounced and do much better based on what platform, right? So the scholarly, quote unquote, scholarly video essays that I've made, right? And already that tells you a little bit about what is informing my decision to, say, put something on one platform and put something on the other. I think those scholarly video essays, which involve no voiceover, topics that are more academic in nature, arguments that are my own and not merely explanations of film theory, Those, I feel like they belong on Vimeo. Their home is Vimeo. Vimeo is the place where the scholarly video essay community lives. You know, they get a little bit more attention. It's interesting, like those videos I've put on YouTube just to see, they get very little attention there. And it kind of consolidates an intuition that I already had, right? Which is that the nature of YouTube is such that slow, meditative kind of vibe that I think is fairly common in scholarly video essays is just unacceptable on YouTube. I think there's maybe one of my videos that has performed a little bit better, one of my scholarly videos that has performed a bit better on YouTube. And I think that's because it's about a film that I think people are searching for and not getting a lot of hits. And so they'll get my video that's about this film. But for the most part, right, YouTube and Vimeo represent very different video essay cultures. And, you know, that's one of the reasons that I don't dare put any of my video lectures on Vimeo, right? Vimeo is an extension of a kind of artist space, video artists, and scholarly video essays are kind of extension of that. So I feel very self-conscious about putting anything with such a lack of polish like my video lectures on Vimeo. Interestingly, I have put some of what I call my video essay lectures. So there's like a third kind of video that I make, which is I take a lecture that I've made, I try to create a YouTube style video out of it to kind of make it more appealing to students and maybe see if other people on the internet will like it. They do not do very well on Vimeo at all. And frankly, those are the videos I've put the most time into. To be honest, I have a video on Speed Racer that I made for that very class I was discussing earlier, and I put a lot of time into that video. It hasn't gotten a huge traction on YouTube, which is where it lives, but I also just put it on Vimeo. I don't think it's gotten any traction on Vimeo at all. And I wouldn't call it unpolished with respect to the others, right? Because it took a great deal of time, but it does have that kind of entertainment aesthetic that I associate with YouTube, right? You know, chill beats, as the kids say, overlaying images. So yeah, it's really interesting just to see that these two spaces create completely different aesthetics and values.
I really appreciate what you're saying because I think, and it actually calls into question the way that I've kind of framed this conversation in the past, which is like, oh, you either decide that you're making work for YouTube or Vimeo. And then that kind of, I feel like I've always thought of it as like that the work you create in like which platform you want to live on informs the work you create. But it seems like for you, it's you create the work and then you find the correct home, which is really useful way to think about it. So let's talk about The Wind in the Trees from early cinema to Pixar, which is a video that exists on your Vimeo, and that's how I first discovered it. Before I ask you to just kind of walk us through the creation of this video, I'll just offer a brief explanation for why I chose it, because Jordan asked me to select the videos of his to talk about, is because what's so great is you can if I just showed this video and one of your video lectures, I think someone could perhaps discern that they were made by the same person, you know, because you're kind of borrowing that same pedagogical approach in this video. You are engaging with your own analysis here more so. You dip into the poetics here. You go with text on screen instead of voiceover. And so it's a really interesting way of engaging with your body of work to see the similarities, but also the differences and these questions of audience and where it's housed and who it's for. So I would just be curious for you to just kind of walk us through how this video came to be.
The video came to be when I asked the publisher of my current book if I could make videographic accompaniments to my chapters. And my publisher said, sure, why not? I had been inspired by a good friend of mine who published his book on a somewhat similar topic. He's an animation scholar. He also did videographic accompaniments, and I had no idea that was a thing one could do. And so I just kind of asked if this is something that I could do, and he said yes. And then I had something to do over the summer in which I asked. I was kind of looking for a project. And so what this video essay is in origin is supposed to be an accompaniment to one of the chapters of my book, which I had already kind of published an article version of. But the main thing that I wanted to do, say a little bit differently from how my friend did his, was I wanted the video to be a standalone piece. I wanted anyone who could pick it up to understand at least an argument. Not all of the arguments in the essay, not the entirety of them, but I wanted to create some kind of linear argumentative piece that could stand on its own. And I wanted that to be the model for all of the essays, video essays that I made to accompany the book. Of course, I made them long before the book came out. And so I just had these things. And so I put them up on Vimeo and I gave them their own titles, not indicating that they were part of a book project, but just saying, hey, these are these things that I made. I put them up on Vimeo, which is where the scholarly video essay community lives. And that was that. Yeah, I guess a lot of the aesthetic choices that I made, like not doing voiceover, doing text, came from the practices that I was most comfortable with that I learned at Video Camp in 2017. I think I heard you say, Will, in one of your episodes that you were more comfortable, or you meant that you were less comfortable with voiceover than you were with text on screen, even though I've seen some of your voiceover work and I think it's really good. I was similarly very uncomfortable with doing voiceover. I couldn't listen to myself speak. And I couldn't ever get the tone. Like, am I going for this like a seriousness? Like, am I going full Koganada, or am I trying to do like this entertainment, like fun voice thing? I didn't feel comfortable like performing a version of my voice at all, but I was very comfortable with this text on screen thing, right? And so I was like, that's how I'm going to do these things. But I also want to create music because I want to create a mood. It's like it's unfair almost, right? Like you can transform something with the right music piece, and this, if you're really savvy at it, create various musical pieces and time them correctly. But yeah, I wanted to create a text on screen, shortened, simplified version of one of the arguments within the essay, which is very much about the myth of the wind of the trees, which is a major kind of anecdote within film theory that, early spectators, when they were first looking at films in the years, say, 1895 to 1899, were fixated on small kind of natural movements like leaves swaying in the background of films, or dust particles, or rippling waves. And this was something that I had been fascinated by for a long time. I came up with the idea for a kind of an original argument about it pretty early on in my academic career. I was a TA for an early film history course. And I remember the professor kind of telling his students about this and then giving a kind of a simple explanation. And I thought, wait a minute, that can't be the explanation. I mean, that makes a certain sense, but there's so much more to this thing, right? So I had a very kind of nerdy scholarly interest in coming up with an explanation for this phenomenon that satisfied me. So yeah, I held on to this idea for a long time, and much later got to make a videographic version of it. I believe Chris Keathley's book it's called Cinephilia and History, or The Wind in the Trees. And so it's such a beautiful and poetic image. Like, to engage with it at all, it just like, it demands, as you say, like the mood that your music evokes, and just the kind of the text on screen for me, I think, is my way of making sure that I'm focusing on the image. Like, I think sometimes when I do a voiceover, I get so caught up in that maybe I'm not as good at having the two interact. Some people are really good at it, but I think that's kind of where I struggle. And so for here, I think that the text on screen works because it's just the music just kind of allows us it envelops us in the image and the poetics of it all. And I'm wondering, did you think about, like, one thing that I like about this is that, we think of that poetic explanatory spectrum, and there's a ton of room for nuance there. And this video is one such example because it contains that amount of text that we might expect from a more explanatory, scholarly video. But this video is also deeply poetic. It moved me, and I'm wondering did you think about I'm getting the sense that you did, like, that you thought about these rhetorical approaches, and it seems like that's what makes the piece be able to stand on its own more than anything, is that commitment to the poetic. Yeah. No, I mean, initially with my thought about these, I wasn't thinking that they would have any kind of poetic value at all. I wanted them to be useful, right? Because they were supplementary. And then when I kind of committed to the idea that they wouldn't be merely supplements, that I wanted them to stand on its own, right? Commitment build on commitment. And I was like, oh, you know what? This is becoming this thing that has its own vibe. And I want it to be able to to speak to somebody who is not interested in this book at all, who has no idea about the written version, but that this is a piece on its own. And I think I was also encouraged by a friend of mine, Nicole Morse, who was also at Video Camp 2017, who was a colleague of mine at U Chicago, and we went to Video Camp the same year. So when I was making these videos, I was circulating a draft of each of them to my writing group, who are peers of mine at U Chicago, Nicole being one of them. And Nicole really kept reminding me to try to let the image speak for itself when it could. They were so good at reminding me about the poetic not being divorced from the explanatory, that you could find moments of poetry, that you don't have to explain this here. You can actually just use the words and have them stand next to each other. So I really owe it to, say, friends and peers who are invested in certain aesthetic principles to remind you that, hey, sometimes less is more. I had a hard time with this at Video Camp because, the video that I made there was based on an article. And so, the argument was my baby, and I didn't want to say, decrease the specificity and nuance of the argument by taking away words, taking away explanation. But so much of what they're teaching you there is for the image and sound to speak for itself. And what you'll lose in like a kind of philosophical rigor that you might get from statements and phrases, you can gain something else, right? You can let a viewer just sit with an image for a little bit. In this case, I could let viewers sit with, say, 2 words on screen, right? I talk a lot about the difference between what I call unplanned movement and unplannable movement, which I explain at length in my essay. It's supposed to be a very fine-grained linguistic distinction that's going to help us understand the difference between certain two types of cinematic contingency, right? But there's a moment in the video where I just kind of let unplanned and unplannable sit up there as words, and then I have images underneath them and hope that the viewer is starting to understand the distinction. I don't know if it works, right? But the commitment to say, sometimes you can let words sit back. Sometimes you can let an image linger for a little bit, or there's a moment in the music that you just want a musical phrase to end and for the viewer to rest with it for a second. I think those are good spaces for the poetic, right? And I agree. There are those moments in there, and I think that's what makes it successful if it is successful.
I imagine that's a deceptively simple thing to do. Like, did you find that hard to pinpoint the exact word that would like capture it and know when to place it together, or is it one of those things that as you're editing and as you're thinking through it just kind of falls together?
Well, yeah, like the idea of, say, highlighting one word with a particular color or something is what you're referring to, right?
Right. And then knowing like that's the word I'm going to highlight and that's the word that I'm going to fade to. And then I'm going to hinge everything essentially around those 2 words. Like, I think I'm always curious because when I watch the video, I'm like, makes perfect sense. Like, of course. But and you might have already answered this in your last question, but just like the thought process to get to that point is, I imagine, or I know that a lot of thinking and planning and messing around must be in the lead up to deciding on those 2 words and how to like land the punch.
No, absolutely. And I think especially for this kind of video where I've already made a 30-page single-spaced version of this argument, and now I have to whittle down my language to like, half a page of words, right? So like words are these things where I had as many of them as I wanted, right? And now I'm creating, this aesthetic challenge where I do not get as many of them, right? And so it really makes you think about like the precise words that you're going to put on the screen at any given moment. And then, of course, the idea of, say, highlighting particular words is just another way to kind of double down on your word choice, right? Like, I'm going to tell you that this word really matters, and how am I going to do that, right? So I think in one way, this is something that I just habitually do when I teach with lectures. I tend to like highlight particular words when I have passages from other theorists or when I'm summarizing something. And I remember a friend of mine saw me give a conference talk, and he said, I like the way you're highlighting certain words in yellow. And it's like, it's really simple, but I never really thought about it. And it's like, it's really useful. I was like fixating on those words. And I was like, oh, you know what? I guess it is useful. And that's cool because I never really thought about it. And then it became something that I did a lot in these particular videos, right? And a lot of the arguments, they do come from very fine distinctions, or at least this is my attempt, between particular terms, right? I have this really bad habit in my writing of italicizing way too much. And that's because I'm trying to say, no, this word as opposed to that one matters, right? And of course my editor is like, you need to take these italics away, which I get, it's a crutch. But in a way, right, I got to kind of do my italicizing thing with color and create maybe a little bit of visual interest. Whereas maybe, when you're reading it on the page with italics everywhere, it becomes obnoxious.
Even if you have, as you say, this 30-page single space argument, trying to work with the same material in this way will teach you something new, challenge it, and in talking with, not just academics, but critics that I know and colleagues and things, it's I always say and always talk about, I just feel that this kind of work, even if you don't want to primarily be a video essayist and that's not what you want to do, that if you don't try and engage in some way, it doesn't even need to result in a single standalone poetic great piece. If you're not at least trying to tackle it from a different way, especially in our current digital environment, you're kind of missing out, assuming you have access to resources and all those things that, goes without saying. But no, it's a beautiful testament to, I think, the potential of this work. And so I'm excited to now go and read your book and kind of reverse engineer and see how things turn out. One final question that I have for you is that I personally, watching those Lumiere films and seeing you manipulate them, in particular the moment where you kind of do the zoom in on the wind in the trees, just that moves me, because it in that we see the beginning and end of film history. If we have these early films and now here you are showcasing the digital technology that we have now to find a new way to appreciate them. And it was just really great. I just wanted to say that to you. And I would just be curious to hear just kind of this in relation to your own cinephilia and what it was like to work with this material that is so special, I guess.
The desire to make the video, or something that I was excited about, was finally what I can do is I can zoom in on the marginal, right? The anecdote is that the marginal was in a sense mentally zoomed in on by the spectator, right? And we are told this. And when I was shown this film, as a graduate student, and told this anecdote, it was, the baby's breakfast, and the part of the screen that they're talking about is really just, a fragment of the screen that's in the top right. And now I can visually represent what it feels like to fixate your attention on a marginal part of the screen. And it's a fairly simple thing to do, but it was deeply satisfying, right? I think that's kind of what you're getting at, was there's something satisfying about seeing the thing that I know in film history was the thing that got people excited, to have it take over the entire screen, right? And, speaking of cinephilia, I'd really gotten interested in this whole idea very early on in my academic career, reading books like Chris Keithley's Cinephilia in History or The Wind in the Trees. I was obsessed with that book. I read it. I learned so much from that book, and I realized that it was putting together ways of thinking from an entire history of film theory. Frankly, I had never really seen before I got a hold of this book. My interests have never really departed that much from the stuff that Chris talks about. Some of my writing responds directly to what Chris Keithley argues, and sometimes it's opposed to Chris Keithley, but what that really means is it's because I learned it from Chris Keithley and people of his ilk, and I never lost my fascination with this stuff. And I think what you can do with videographic criticism, that you can take the marginal and blow it up, or you can slow it down. You can get people to fixate on things that are ephemeral and fleeting. That itself is a visual instantiation of a mode of spectatorship that some, like Chris, will call cinephilia. And so it made perfect sense, I think, for me to create videographic supplements for each of these chapters that are somewhat about cinephilic modes of seeing. Most of the things in my book are about tiny little fragments of movement. And I'm like, this thing is interesting. Do you think it's interesting? I want to show you why I think it's interesting. You can read my chapter about it, but better yet, let me show it to you. And, do you see what I see? Right. And so that do you see what I see, I think, is at the basis of this phenomenon that Chris is interested in, historicizing and theorizing and investigating as this like aspect of film theory that has this beautiful through line.
I think you've just summed up like exactly what I love so much about this forum, which is I saw this thing, now I want to show you. If that is the through line through a video, going back to what we talked about in your original supercut, it will, I think, almost always like strike a chord and come across. No, it's very exciting. And Chris's book is fantastic, obviously, although I have a million biases when it comes to Chris. But and I'd actually be very curious to hear, I don't know if you've talked to him, what he would make of this video essay, because I know he has a lot of views on animation and cinema and things like that. So I'd be very curious to hear what he has to say. So Chris, if you want to call in, yeah.
I wondered that myself. When I got to Video Camp, I had written these papers that were kind of arguing against Chris's book, but I didn't tell him that I was writing this, and once again, I say, if I'm arguing with someone, it probably means I'm a big fan and I love them. I'm a big fan of Chris Keithley. When I got to know him, it was so great. But I never really got a chance to sit down and say, hey, did you realize that I spent a long time of, my dissertation and now book basically reading your book and responding to it. So I don't know. We haven't had that conversation, but maybe someday we will.
Yes, I would love to be in the audience for that conversation. Now let us transition to talking about the video that you've selected for us to talk about. A video by Grace Lee, who was the third guest on this podcast, I believe, a very early guest, and who I've gotten to know, and who made this video that I think everyone engaged with the video essay world has probably seen. And if not, you should go see it right away. But I'll leave it to you, Jordan, to introduce it to us and to just kind of offer why you selected it for us to talk about. And obviously it makes a natural fit for this podcast. But I'd just be curious to hear why it, resonated with you.
Yeah. So the video, which I believe is entitled "What Isn't a Video Essay," is the latest from Grace Lee's YouTube channel. What's so great about that? It is an examination, a kind of whimsical exploration of the question, what isn't a video essay? But really what I think about it is an introduction to topics about categorization and concept formation, which are really about kind of philosophy and social theory. And the thing that I think I love most about this video is that it takes this kind of playful, almost innocuous kind of question, what isn't a video essay? And it analogizes it to other playful kind of internet meme questions like, is a sandwich a hot dog? Or is Die Hard a Christmas movie, or is it not? And it takes those really kind of fun, impossible not to jump into a conversation about topics as a way to introduce fairly rigorous and interesting and difficult and puzzling questions about what makes a category, how do categories function, how do we tease apart these conceptual puzzles, and then finds its way back into the question about video essay scholarship. And it almost kind of reflects some of the things that we've been talking about today, which is like the practices divided between YouTube and Vimeo. This is the first time where I've seen someone in a video essay kind of talk about the differences between YouTube and Vimeo in a way that was so satisfying. And I was reading the comments below the video, and I get so stoked when I see like really, really popular video essayists be like, yes, you are the greatest at this. And, I am someone, for example, who has 150,000 followers, but you are the best at this. And I'm like, yes, I'm so glad when people get that Grace Lee is the best at this.
You touched on something that I think if I was to describe what I so appreciate about Grace's work, Grace's ability to tie several different online discourses together and to make it this cohesive whole, like to address this YouTube Vimeo thing, and is a hot dog a sandwich, and like engaging with like scholarly resources, and knowing that this video is going to go out into these communities and have a response from it, and knowing that you have to engage with all of that and with it will be satisfactory to all these different stakeholders is like jaw-dropping. Grace is a very humble person, so I'm sure if we like asked like, how do you do it? Like but it is like, I'm just like amazed by it, and I can see you nodding. So I'll pass the baton to you.
Yeah, jaw-dropping and amazing are things that I often think, or I get envious from, like, that is a perfect way to say that thing and to show it, right? The humor, like the visual humor tied with vocal performance, tied all together, it astounds me. Because if anyone has ever tried to be entertaining on a video, it is so incredibly difficult, or to be humorous. And to realize how much of that comes down to minutia of timing and vocal cues. It astounds me, but just the level of a sensitivity to audiovisual presentation is extraordinary to me.
And also, for example, there's one moment where Grace quotes, I think, the writer Gia Tolentino, and it's just a quick reference to essentially how this obsession with categorization can be tied to companies wanting to get more and more data points, and kind of the growth of capitalism, and wanting to know how to market to you, and knowing exactly what you want and need. All of it might last 15 seconds. I'm not sure, but like talking about like the brevity thing we were talking about in your, Wind in the Trees video, it's just like a quick punch kind of. You get it, it sticks with you, it's there, but then it's on to the next, but it doesn't feel overly brief. And that is such a skill that goes, I think, like, that maybe looks deceptively simple and easy, because A, it's a combination of knowing exactly how to put things, but then B, knowing when to move on. Like having it almost feels like a gut instinct.
Like, I almost want to show videos to my students and be like, look, the Rick Altman essay, the star of the show, don't you feel excited that I've given you these PDFs, that they're like they have been animated and scrolled through and underlined? The scripts seem to be interested in not simply having things being simple and explanatory. It seems as if the words have a poetry and a kind of humor and a specificity that kind of, you're just barely holding on in a way, right? They're fast-paced, they're thoughtful, and they're super intelligent. When I was rewatching the video for this discussion, I had to like stop and say, oh, did I understand the entire subclaim that happened within 7 seconds there? Because I didn't get it the first time around, right? And the same thing goes with visual references.
I was also going through the comments of this, and I just want to read one by someone named Tom Nicholas, who commented, "Can't believe my favorite video essayist just defined the video essay out of existence." And I love that comment, because the video kind of seems to be doing two things at once, and perhaps you have a take on this and can help me work through what I'm trying to say, but I'll do the best I can. Grace starts by leaning into a kind of subjective argument and saying, like, I have this art background. Starts with the subjective and then kind of veers off into looking at both sides, and all, like, or not both sides, but just like leaning into the ambiguity of it all, and not actually trying to make this one bold claim. I'm more telling you what I think about it so that you understand how I'm feeling my way through this, but the conclusion is not like this is a video essay and this isn't. In fact, it leads with more questions, and ultimately, in a way, perhaps reinforces the idea that like anything can be a video essay.
Dialectic is not a word I like to throw around, because I find it's often used, and I guess I'm just meaning something close to what Plato would mean by dialectical, but like a back and forth between one argument and its counter argument, being lobbied back and forth until we narrow into something closer to enlightenment, right? Right. I would say if the video ends on something, it tries to end on the idea of categorization, not as something that comes down from the sky, but as something that's formed by human beings and that can get you to see new things. But I wouldn't say that is the thesis of the essay. I would say the aim of the essay is to elucidate various complexities about the topic of categorization that that seem to dovetail nicely with this interesting puzzle about what makes a video essay and what could be excluded from that category. But also it's the kind of way of writing that is so difficult to do. Like I could not, as you were saying earlier, I could not do a Grace Lee style video essay. It would be so difficult. You know, I've been stuck in a way of thinking and writing for a while. I don't think I could manage to do what maybe sometimes within teaching, I'll try to model that kind of thing, where I'm not committed to a particular position that I want to make, but I'm just interested in exploding something.
Absolutely. I think that notion of pedagogy brings us full circle in this conversation, and I think is a great place to end. Jordan, thank you so much for your time and for joining the Video Essay Podcast, and I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It was great to be here, and I'm honored to chat with you.